In the early hours of January 16, 2009, a utility worker discovered a chilling scene on a snow-covered road in Connecticut, a running SUV with a lifeless woman inside. What appeared to be a tragic accident would soon unravel into one of the most twisted tales of love, lies, and murder that this quiet town had ever seen. The woman was 39-year-old Theresa Wagner, mother of three, wife of a millionaire pharmaceutical executive, and living what seemed like the perfect American dream. But beneath the surface of this picture-perfect family lurked secrets so dark, deceptions so elaborate, and a web of lies so tangled that when the truth finally emerged, it would shock even the most seasoned investigators. Welcome back to Once Upon a Voice, where beneath the surface of every lie lies the truth. I'm your host, and today we're diving deep into a case that will make you question everything you think you know about love, trust, and the lengths people will go to protect their carefully constructed facades. Stefan Wagner was born on May 26, 1951, in the small town of Collegeville, Pennsylvania. The eldest of four brothers, Stefan grew up in a Catholic household where hard work and education were valued above all else. His father operated a hosiery mill, and while the family lived modestly, they were proud and tight-knit. From an early age, Stefan displayed an exceptional aptitude for science and mathematics. However, he struggled socially. Classmates described him as living in his own world. His severe asthma didn't help matters, often keeping him isolated from typical childhood activities. But Stefan had dreams that extended far beyond the limitations of his small hometown and his physical ailments. As Stefan grew taller, eventually reaching an impressive 6 feet 3 inches, his asthma improved enough for him to join his high school basketball team. This gave him some social connections, but those who knew him said he always maintained a certain emotional distance. He dated occasionally, but his relationships never seemed to develop into anything serious. His true passion was science, particularly medicine, and his goal was crystal clear. He wanted to become a researcher who could change the world. Stefan worked his way through Temple University in Philadelphia, earning a PhD in pharmacology from the prestigious Bells Research Institute at Temple School of Medicine. He was brilliant, dedicated, and driven, but also increasingly aware that his social awkwardness made forming deep relationships difficult. During his graduate studies, Stefan met Sylvie, an Orthodox Jewish woman who shared his intellectual curiosity. They married quickly, perhaps both believing that shared ambitions could substitute for deeper emotional connection. For 7 years, they tried to make it work, but fundamental differences, religious, cultural, and personal, eventually drove them apart. The divorce was amicable, but left Stefan feeling like a failure in yet another aspect of life. Now here's where our story takes an interesting turn. By the early 1990s, Stefan had established himself as a respected researcher in respiratory medicine. He worked at various hospitals, always treating his patients with genuine empathy and care, especially children with asthma, perhaps because he understood their struggles so personally. But as he approached 40, Stefan began to feel a deep loneliness that his professional success couldn't fill. Have you ever felt like success in one area of your life couldn't make up for emptiness in another? Let me know in the comments. I think many of us can relate to Stefan's feelings, even if we never go to his extremes. In 1995, Stefan was working at a research hospital when a casual conversation in the cafeteria would change his life forever. A young Filipino colleague mentioned her hometown newspaper, and Stefan, intrigued by the idea of connecting with someone from a completely different culture, asked to see it. That newspaper contained a small classified ad that would set everything in motion. Young woman seeks English-speaking pen pal to practice language and learn about American culture. Friendship only. Photo included. The photo showed a beautiful young woman with kind eyes and a gentle smile. Her name was Theresa Davis, and she was 25 years old, though Stefan would later lie about this detail too. Something about her expression struck him immediately. Perhaps it was her obvious intelligence, or maybe it was the hope he saw in her eyes, the same hope for a better life that he remembered from his own childhood. But here's where Stefan made his first fateful decision to deceive. Instead of being honest about who he was, Stefan sent Theresa a photograph that was several years old, making himself appear younger and more attractive. More significantly, he lied about his age, claiming to be 37 when he was actually 44. In his mind, he probably rationalized this as a small deception, just giving them a chance to connect before physical realities got in the way. Their correspondence began innocently enough, but Stefan quickly became emotionally invested in a way that surprised even him. For the first time in his life, he felt like he could truly open up to someone. Through letters, he shared his dreams, his work, his hopes for the future. And Theresa responded with equal openness about her own aspirations.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
Theresa Davis had grown up in a small coastal town in the Philippines, one of 7 children in a family that struggled financially but was rich in love and support. Her childhood home sat above the waters of Manila Bay, a modest structure without electricity or running water, but filled with laughter and the close bonds that often develop in large families facing hardship together. Despite their poverty, Theresa was exceptionally bright and ambitious. Her father often said she was the most determined of all his children. At 16, she had been one of the few from her village accepted into a prestigious school of administration and business, a tremendous honor that represented hope for her entire family. But dreams cost money, and Theresa's parents simply couldn't afford the tuition. After just 1 semester, she had to leave school, though her parents promised to save every penny they could to eventually pay for her education. But Theresa wasn't willing to wait. She moved to live with an aunt in a town that housed an American military base, where she found work as a waitress in a restaurant that catered to American servicemen. This job gave her regular contact with native English speakers and reinforced her dream of somehow making it to America, the land of opportunity she'd heard so much about. When Stefan's first letter arrived, Theresa saw it as a sign. Here was an educated, successful American man who seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and dreams, not just her appearance. Their correspondence quickly became the highlight of both their lives. Within months, Stefan was writing about marriage and children, topics that resonated deeply with Theresa, who had always put family at the center of her life goals. Neither told their families about this unusual long-distance relationship, perhaps both sensing that others might not understand the depth of connection they felt they'd found. In today's world of online dating and social media, it might seem strange that 2 people could fall in love through letters alone. But do you think there's something more genuine about that slower, more thoughtful form of communication? Share your thoughts below. After nearly a year of increasingly intimate correspondence, Stefan made a promise that would change both their lives forever. He would come to the Philippines to meet Theresa in person, and if they felt the same connection face-to-face, they would marry. For Theresa, this represented the culmination of every dream she'd ever had. For Stefan, it was perhaps the biggest risk he'd ever taken, but also the first time he felt truly hopeful about finding lasting happiness. Their first meeting in June 1995 was, by all accounts, awkward and revealing. When Stefan stepped off the plane in Manila, Theresa immediately noticed the discrepancy between the man before her and the photograph she'd treasured for months. He looked significantly older than she expected, and while still handsome, he clearly wasn't the 37-year-old he claimed to be. But here's what makes this story so complex. Despite feeling deceived, Theresa didn't call off their plans. Perhaps she was already too emotionally invested, or maybe she recognized something genuine in Stefan's character that transcended his physical appearance or age deception. Stefan, for his part, was shocked by the poverty in which Theresa's family lived, but rather than being put off, he was moved by their dignity and warmth. Stefan immediately promised to support Theresa's family financially, a promise he would keep for many years. Theresa's father, after spending time with Stefan, gave his blessing for the marriage. He saw in this American man someone who genuinely cared for his daughter and had the means to provide her with opportunities she'd never have otherwise. On June 11, 1995, Stefan and Theresa were married in a simple ceremony in the Philippines. On the marriage certificate, Stefan listed his birth year as 1958, making the age deception official and legal. None of Stefan's family attended. In fact, none of them even knew about the wedding. And here's where the web of lies becomes even more tangled. Stefan was embarrassed about how they'd met, fearing his family would think he'd simply bought a mail-order bride. So he and Theresa concocted a cover story. They would tell everyone they'd met in Hawaii, where Stefan had been speaking at a medical conference. It seemed like a harmless lie, just a way to make their unconventional love story seem more conventional. But lies, even small ones, have a way of growing and multiplying. The visa process took nearly a year, during which Stefan and Theresa maintained their relationship through letters, both counting down the days until they could start their new life together. Finally, on April 19, 1996, Theresa stepped off a plane at JFK International Airport, officially beginning her American dream. What do you think about Theresa's decision to go through with the marriage despite Stefan's deception about his age? Was she being practical, forgiving, or do you think she was making a mistake? I'm curious about your perspectives on this complex situation. Stefan and Theresa settled in North Carolina, where Stefan had accepted a position as a research professor at East Carolina University. For their honeymoon, they spent several weeks touring California, a magical time that both would later describe as some of the happiest days of their lives. When they returned to North Carolina, Stefan proudly introduced Theresa as his wife, sticking to their rehearsed story about meeting in Hawaii. Some colleagues were surprised by the sudden marriage, and a few suspected the truth might be more complicated, but everyone was happy to see Stefan so genuinely joyful. Their happiness seemed to multiply when Theresa became pregnant shortly after her arrival. On January 29, 1997, their son Harper was born, followed by Charlotte on November 8, 1998, and finally little Sienna on March 22, 2003. Stefan was a devoted father who kept family photos prominently displayed in his office and spoke constantly about his wife and children to anyone who would listen. He often said that Theresa had given him the greatest gift imaginable, a real family. For someone who had always struggled with relationships, this sense of belonging was transformative. Theresa, meanwhile, was adapting to American life with remarkable grace. She made friends in their North Carolina community, learned to navigate American customs and bureaucracy, and threw herself into motherhood with the same determination she'd always shown. To everyone who knew them, the Wagners seemed like a genuinely happy family. But even during these golden years, there were signs of the possessiveness that would later turn deadly. Stefan was intensely protective of his beautiful wife, sometimes in ways that made others uncomfortable. If he noticed other men paying attention to Theresa at social gatherings, he would quickly find reasons to redirect her attention or suggest they leave early. He framed this as romantic devotion, and Theresa seemed to interpret it that way too. But looking back, it was clear that Stefan lived in constant fear of losing what he gained.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
In 2000, Stefan's career reached a major milestone when he founded Genesis Biotech, a pharmaceutical company focused on developing revolutionary treatments for respiratory conditions. His specialty was asthma, fitting, given his own childhood struggles with the condition. Stefan's breakthrough came in 2002 when he published a groundbreaking study in the prestigious journal Nature. His team had successfully reduced asthma symptoms in laboratory animals using a technique called DNA antisense therapy. The concept was revolutionary. Instead of just treating asthma symptoms after they appeared, what if they could silence the genes that caused asthma in the first place? The pharmaceutical world took notice immediately. Stefan developed an inhalable gene therapy called GBT 2010, and suddenly investors were lining up. For a brief, shining moment, it seemed like Stefan Wagner might actually cure asthma, a disease that affected millions of people worldwide, including himself. The money poured in. Stefan's company received multi-million-dollar investments, and their family's lifestyle changed dramatically. They bought new luxury cars. Stefan sent substantial amounts of money to Theresa's family in the Philippines, enabling them to purchase land and improve their living conditions. And in 2005, they purchased a sprawling mansion in the affluent Hartford County area of Connecticut. And here's where success began to plant the seeds of destruction. Have you ever noticed how sudden wealth or success can sometimes change people or put pressure on relationships in unexpected ways? What do you think happens when someone's entire identity becomes tied to their professional achievements? The Wagner family's new home in Connecticut was everything Theresa had once dreamed of, a massive house with every luxury imaginable, situated in one of the most prestigious neighborhoods in the state. Stefan spared no expense, claiming he bought the house specifically to make Theresa happy, as a testament to how much he loved her. But for Theresa, the move represented a devastating loss of the community she'd built in North Carolina. In their previous home, she'd had close friends, familiar routines, and places where she felt she belonged. Now she was starting over in a place where she knew no one, while Stefan became increasingly absorbed in his expanding business. The isolation was particularly difficult because Stefan's possessiveness had grown along with his success. When Theresa expressed interest in joining a local gym to exercise and meet people, Stefan instead had an elaborate home gym constructed. When she mentioned wanting to take classes or volunteer in the community, he found reasons why those activities might be problematic or time-consuming. What Stefan framed as loving protection, Theresa was beginning to recognize as a golden cage. Meanwhile, beneath the surface of their apparent success, serious problems were brewing. The house had been purchased with a massive mortgage that stretched their finances, but Stefan was determined to maintain the image of unlimited wealth. When Theresa expressed interest in expensive purchases, designer clothes, home improvements, or generous gifts for her family, Stefan always said yes, even when it strained their budget significantly. More troubling was what was happening at Genesis Biotech. After the initial excitement about GBT 2010, the drug began encountering serious problems in human trials. While it had shown promise in animal testing, it proved far less effective in actual patients, particularly those who were already using other asthma medications. Stefan was brilliant at presenting encouraging preliminary results to investors, but he was privately becoming aware that his miracle cure might not be the breakthrough he promised. The pressure was enormous. Millions of dollars in investment, his professional reputation, and his family's entire lifestyle all depended on the success of this single medication. In 2006, Theresa learned a devastating truth that shattered her trust in her husband completely. At Stefan's brother's birthday party, during casual family conversation, Stefan's mother mentioned that Stefan was her oldest son, a comment that confused Theresa greatly, since Stefan had always told her that the brother whose birthday they were celebrating was the eldest. That night, Theresa confronted Stefan about his age, and the truth finally came out. Stefan had been lying about his age for their entire relationship, not by a year or two, but by 8 full years. He was 55 years old, not 47, as she believed. Every important document in their marriage, every conversation about their future, every plan they'd made had been built on this fundamental deception. Stefan apologized profusely, explaining that he'd been afraid she wouldn't give him a chance if she'd known his real age. He promised there were no other lies, no other deceptions. But the damage was done. Theresa began to wonder what else about their marriage might not be what it seemed. Age gaps in relationships can be controversial under the best circumstances, but lying about your age for over a decade? That's a whole different level of deception. How do you think you would react if you discovered your partner had been lying about something so fundamental? Let me know your thoughts. In early 2006, as Theresa was grappling with her husband's age deception and feeling increasingly isolated in their Connecticut mansion, she decided to focus on creating something beautiful, a garden that would give her a project and hopefully some joy. Stefan approved the expensive landscaping project immediately, eager to do anything that might help repair their relationship. The garden was designed to cost $50,000, a significant sum, but Stefan was still maintaining the illusion of unlimited wealth. The landscaper Theresa hired was a charming man named Joshua Taylor. Unlike Stefan, Joshua was close to Theresa's actual age, emotionally available, and seemed genuinely interested in her thoughts and feelings beyond just pleasing her. What started as conversations about plant placement and garden design gradually evolved into something much more personal. And here's where our story takes its most dangerous turn. By 2007, Theresa and Joshua were having a full-blown affair. For Theresa, it represented everything her marriage lacked: genuine emotional connection, passion, and someone who saw her as an equal partner rather than a possession to be protected and controlled. Theresa also made a practical decision that would prove crucial later. She found work as a beauty consultant at Macy's department store. Officially, it was just something to keep her busy and help her meet people. In reality, she was secretly saving money, preparing for what she increasingly believed would be an inevitable divorce. Stefan sensed something was wrong, but couldn't quite pinpoint what. He checked phone bills obsessively and noticed that Theresa seemed happier when he wasn't around, a painful realization for someone who had always feared abandonment. In July 2008, Stefan's worst fears were confirmed when he discovered concrete evidence of Theresa's affair. But rather than confronting her directly, Stefan devised one of the most elaborate and manipulative schemes in true crime history. Stefan decided to become his own wife's blackmailer. Using voice disguise techniques, Stefan called his own house and spoke to Theresa, claiming to be someone who had recorded her intimate encounters with Joshua. The blackmailer demanded $500,000 and played what sounded like audio of Theresa and Joshua together. Terrified and ashamed, Theresa confessed everything to Stefan and promised to end the affair immediately. Stefan then called Joshua directly, threatening to expose the affair to Joshua's wife and family if he didn't stay away from Theresa. But here's the truly chilling part of Stefan's plan. to make the blackmail scheme seem credible, Stefan actually reported it to the police. He figured this would both provide cover for his knowledge of the affair and make him seem like a supportive husband trying to protect his family from a dangerous criminal. The police investigation quickly stalled. There was no evidence of an actual blackmailer, no specifics about money drop locations, and the whole scenario seemed suspicious. But Stefan had achieved his immediate goal. The affair had ended, and Theresa seemed committed to saving their marriage. Meanwhile, Stefan's professional life was collapsing completely. Genesis Biotech's miracle asthma drug had failed definitively in clinical trials. The dot-com crash had made investors extremely cautious about biotechnology ventures. In March 2008, Stefan was forced out of his own company by investors who installed new management and essentially abandoned his research entirely. Stefan was left with no income, massive debts, and a lifestyle he couldn't possibly maintain, but he couldn't bear to tell Theresa the truth about their financial situation. Stefan's blackmail scheme is one of the most psychologically manipulative things I've ever encountered in a true crime case. What do you think drives someone to such elaborate deception rather than just having an honest conversation? And do you think Theresa had any chance of saving this marriage, or was it doomed from the start? By late 2008, Stefan was living an utterly unsustainable life. He had no income but continued spending as if nothing had changed. He bought expensive cars, maintained their costly lifestyle, and even increased the money he sent to Theresa's family, all while their debts mounted to catastrophic levels. Stefan began drinking heavily, and the antidepressants prescribed by his doctor seemed to make his mood swings worse rather than better. He would have days of manic energy followed by periods of deep depression and paranoid thinking. And then Theresa made a decision that would seal both their fates. Despite her promise to Stefan, Theresa resumed her relationship with Joshua in late 2008. She had realized that the blackmail incident, rather than being a random criminal act, felt too convenient and too perfectly timed. She began to suspect that Stefan himself might have been behind the mysterious calls. More importantly, Theresa had come to understand that her marriage was not just unhappy, it was built on a foundation of lies and control that made genuine intimacy impossible. She wanted out, and she was finally ready to act on that desire. Theresa's work at Macy's gave her both financial independence and emotional distance from Stefan's increasingly erratic behavior. She confided in a few close friends that she was planning to leave her husband, though she was careful not to reveal the details of her affair. Stefan, meanwhile, was becoming increasingly paranoid and desperate. He suspected Theresa was seeing Joshua again, but he also knew that his elaborate blackmail scheme meant he couldn't confront her directly without revealing his own manipulation. His drinking increased, his mood swings became more severe, and he began making cryptic comments to family members about how he couldn't live without Theresa, and how he would do anything to keep his family together. Looking back, those comments were clear warning signs of what was to come. In early January 2009, several events converged that would create the perfect storm for tragedy. Joshua's wife, Patricia, discovered that her husband had resumed his affair with Theresa. She called Theresa directly, threatening her and demanding she stay away from Joshua permanently. Stefan overheard part of this phone call and realized that his worst fears were confirmed. Theresa was still involved with Joshua, and now other people were becoming aware of the situation. His carefully constructed world was crumbling on all fronts. On January 15, 2009, a massive snowstorm hit Connecticut, closing schools and making travel treacherous. But Theresa was determined to work her shift at Macy's. Every dollar she earned brought her closer to independence. That evening, she finished work at 9:15 p.m. and, despite the dangerous driving conditions, met Joshua at their usual motel. They both knew the relationship was becoming increasingly risky, but neither was ready to end it permanently. What neither of them realized was that this would be their final meeting. At this point in the story, if you were Theresa's friend, what would you have advised her to do? Did she have other options, or was the situation already too dangerous to navigate safely? I'm interested in your perspectives on how someone escapes a controlling relationship like this.
If you're enjoying this story, kindly do us a favor and subscribe to our channel. It is free and won't cost anything, but it means the world to us. We're just a small channel trying to grow. Thank you, and back to the video.
At 1 a.m. on January 16, 2009, Theresa Wagner pulled into the garage of the family's Connecticut mansion. She had spent 2 hours with Joshua at their motel, and despite the late hour and dangerous road conditions, she felt a sense of clarity and determination. She had made her final decision, she was leaving Stefan. Stefan was waiting for her in the garage. Later, he would tell investigators that he could tell immediately where she had been. She was dressed nicely, wearing perfume, and had the look of someone who had been with another man. What happened next would haunt investigators for years to come. According to Stefan's eventual confession, Theresa didn't try to lie or make excuses. She told him directly that she had been with Joshua and that their marriage was over. She was taking the children and leaving, and nothing Stefan could say or do would change her mind. For Stefan, this was the moment he had dreaded for nearly 2 decades, the moment when his greatest fear of abandonment became reality. Everything he had worked for, lied for, and sacrificed for was about to disappear. Theresa began gathering some of her belongings, making it clear that this wasn't an emotional outburst or a temporary separation. She was methodically preparing to leave permanently, and that's when Stefan snapped. Stefan later told investigators that he felt like his entire world was ending. In a moment of rage, desperation, and what he would later claim was self-defense, Stefan grabbed a baseball bat that was stored in the garage. He struck Theresa on the head, but she didn't die immediately. She was still conscious, still breathing, and Stefan realized the magnitude of what he had just done. At that moment, he had a choice: call for help and hope that Theresa would survive, or he hit her again. This time, Theresa Wagner died. For several minutes, Stefan stood in his garage with his wife's body, trying to process what he had done. The man who'd spent his entire career trying to save lives had just taken the life of the person he claimed to love most. But Stefan's mind was already moving to his next deception. Instead of calling police and confessing to what had happened, Stefan decided to stage an elaborate cover-up. He placed Theresa's body in her Toyota Land Cruiser and drove to a remote area near Riverside Drive, where he positioned the vehicle to look like she had crashed during the snowstorm. Stefan walked away from the scene, leaving the engine running, and Theresa's body slumped over the steering wheel. In his mind, perhaps he believed that investigators would conclude she had died in a weather-related accident while driving home from work. But Stefan had made several crucial mistakes that would ultimately expose his deception. This is always the most difficult part of these cases for me to understand, the moment when someone chooses to cover up their crime rather than immediately seek help. What do you think was going through Stefan's mind in those minutes after he killed Theresa? Was this plan or a panic decision? At 2:30 a.m. on January 16, 2009, utility worker Leon Wagner, no relation to Stefan, was making his regular rounds when he spotted something that immediately caught his attention. A forest green Toyota Land Cruiser parked at an odd angle near an embankment on Riverside Drive, its engine still running despite the late hour and dangerous weather conditions. Leon approached the vehicle carefully and peered inside. What he saw would stay with him for the rest of his life: a woman's body slumped over the steering wheel, clearly lifeless. Emergency responders arrived quickly, initially assuming they were dealing with a tragic, weather-related accident. Connecticut had been hit hard by the snowstorm, and icy roads had already caused several crashes throughout the area. But experienced investigators don't make assumptions, and within hours, several details about the scene were raising serious questions. The evidence that didn't add up. First, there was only one set of footprints in the snow, leading away from the vehicle toward the woods. No footprints approached the car, which would be expected if Theresa had crashed and someone had tried to help her, or if she had gotten out of the car after the crash and then returned to it. Second, the damage to the SUV was minimal. For a crash severe enough to cause fatal head trauma, investigators expected to see a shattered windshield, deployed airbags, or significant front-end damage. Instead, the vehicle looked almost undamaged. Third, and most troubling, frozen blood was found on the running board and the rear driver's side door of the SUV. If Theresa had been injured inside the vehicle during a crash, there was no logical explanation for how her blood had gotten to those exterior locations. The medical examiner's preliminary findings confirmed investigators' suspicions. Theresa's head trauma was not consistent with injuries typically seen in car accidents. Instead, it appeared she had been struck with a blunt object in a pattern that suggested deliberate, repeated blows. This was not an accident. It was murder, carefully staged to look like something it wasn't. Detective Sarah Mitchell, the lead investigator on the case, immediately began building a list of people who might have had motive to kill Theresa Wagner. The list wasn't long, but it included 3 individuals with clear reasons to want Theresa dead. Stefan Wagner, the controlling husband who was facing financial ruin and the loss of his family; Joshua Taylor, the lover who was caught in an increasingly dangerous affair; and Patricia Taylor, Joshua's wife, who had recently discovered the affair and made threats against Theresa. But from the very beginning, all roads led back to Stefan. When you're looking at a case like this, what do you think investigators focus on first? The person with the most obvious motive, or do they try to eliminate all the possibilities systematically? And which of these three suspects seem most likely to you? When detectives arrived at the Wagner family home to inform Stefan of his wife's death, his reaction was everything they expected from a grieving husband: shock, disbelief, and immediate concern for his 3 children who were asleep upstairs. Stefan claimed he had last spoken to Theresa around 7 p.m. the previous evening, when she had called to say she was staying late at work due to the storm. He said he had gone to bed around 11 p.m., assuming she had decided to spend the night at a colleague's house rather than drive home in dangerous conditions. But even during that initial interview, Detective Mitchell noticed inconsistencies in Stefan's account. At the police station, Stefan's story began to change in small but significant ways. First, he claimed he had spoken to Theresa in the afternoon. Then he said it was in the evening. When pressed about the exact timing, he became evasive and seemed unable to provide consistent details. More troubling was Stefan's behavior during questioning. Rather than asking about the investigation or expressing anger about who might have killed his wife, Stefan seemed primarily focused on controlling the narrative. He repeatedly suggested that Theresa might have simply run away, a theory that made no sense given that her body had been found in her own car. As the investigation deepened, detectives uncovered the complex web of lies and deception that had characterized the Wagner marriage. They learned about Stefan's age deception, his financial problems, the mysterious blackmail incident that had been reported to police months earlier, and most importantly, Theresa's affair with Joshua Taylor. But with Stefan's own words that ultimately sealed his fate. During his third interview with police, Stefan became increasingly agitated and defensive. When Detective Mitchell confronted him with evidence that contradicted his timeline, Stefan finally broke down and confessed to killing his wife. Here's what Stefan told investigators happened that night. When Theresa returned home at 1 a.m., it was obvious she had been with another man. She was dressed up, wearing perfume, and had what Stefan described as that look, the satisfied expression of someone who had been intimate with someone else. Theresa didn't try to deny where she had been. Instead, she told Stefan that their marriage was over and that she was taking the children and leaving permanently. She began gathering her belongings, making it clear that this wasn't an emotional threat, but a concrete plan. Stefan said he felt like his entire world was collapsing. Everything he had worked for, lied for, and built his identity around was about to disappear forever. In that moment of desperation and rage, he grabbed a baseball bat that was stored in the garage. He struck Theresa on the head, intending to stop her from leaving. But she was still alive, still conscious, and Stefan realized what he had done. At that point, he could have called for help, could have tried to save her life. Instead, he chose to hit her again. After Theresa died, Stefan spent several minutes in the garage, trying to decide what to do next. He ultimately decided to stage the scene to look like a car accident, hoping that investigators would conclude she had died in a weather-related crash. Stefan's confession raises so many disturbing questions about the psychology of domestic violence. Do you think his claim that he was trying to stop her from leaving justifies anything about what he did? And what do you make of his decision to stage the scene rather than calling for help after the first blow? Stefan Wagner's trial began in September 2010, nearly 2 years after Theresa's murder. The delay was partly due to the complex nature of the case, and partly because Stefan's defense team was building an argument that would prove controversial and, ultimately, successful. Stefan's lawyers didn't deny that he had killed his wife. Instead, they argued that it was not premeditated murder, but rather voluntary manslaughter committed in the heat of passion. The defense painted a picture of a man who had been driven to desperation by his wife's infidelity and the collapse of everything he had worked for. They emphasized Stefan's lack of prior violent behavior, his genuine love for his children, and the emotional trauma of discovering that his wife was not only having an affair, but was planning to leave him permanently. More controversially, the defense also argued that Theresa had contributed to the situation by continuing her affair despite promising to end it, and by choosing to confront Stefan with her decision to leave in the middle of the night when emotions were running high. The prosecution, led by District Attorney Michael Torres, argued that Stefan's elaborate staging of the crime scene proved that this was not a crime of passion, but calculated murder followed by a deliberate cover-up. They pointed out that Stefan had multiple opportunities to call for help after the first blow, but instead chose to ensure Theresa's death, and then methodically attempted to deceive investigators. The prosecution's case hinged on several key points. The physical evidence at the stage crash scene, including the blood patterns on the exterior of the vehicle and the lack of crash-consistent damage, prove that Stefan had deliberately moved and positioned Theresa's body after killing her. Stefan's elaborate history of deception, from his age lies to the fake blackmail scheme, demonstrated a pattern of manipulation and control that escalated to murder when he realized he was finally losing his grip on Theresa. Most damning was Stefan's behavior immediately after the crime. Instead of calling 911 or trying to save his wife's life, he spent considerable time and effort creating an elaborate fiction designed to avoid responsibility for his actions. The defense's response was equally compelling to some jurors. Stefan's lawyers argued that the staging of the crime scene was not evidence of premeditation, but rather panic and desperation from a man who realized his entire life was over. They portrayed him as someone who made a terrible decision in a moment of overwhelming emotional trauma. They emphasized that Stefan had no history of violence toward Theresa or anyone else, despite years of mounting stress and provocation. This, they argued, supported the theory that January 16th represented a complete psychological break rather than the culmination of a planned murder. The most controversial aspect of the defense was their characterization of Theresa's role in the events. Stefan's lawyers argued that Theresa's decision to continue her affair after promising to end it, combined with her choice to confront Stefan with her plans to leave in the middle of the night, had created an emotionally explosive situation. They stopped just short of blaming Theresa for her own death, but the implication was clear. The jury deliberated for 4 days before reaching their verdict. On October 23, 2010, they found Stefan Wagner guilty of voluntary manslaughter rather than first-degree murder. Stefan was sentenced to 20 years in prison with the possibility of parole after 12 years. The verdict was deeply controversial. Theresa's family felt that justice had not been served. In their view, Stefan had committed premeditated murder and deserved to spend the rest of his life in prison. They were particularly outraged by the defense's attempts to portray Theresa as partially responsible for her own death. Stefan's family, while not condoning his actions, expressed relief that he had not received a life sentence. They maintained that the man who killed Theresa was not the Stefan they knew, that something had fundamentally broken in him during those final months of mounting pressure and deception. Perhaps the most heartbreaking aspect of the Stefan Wagner case was the impact on the 3 children: Harper, 12, Charlotte, 10, and little Sienna, just 6 years old when their mother was murdered and their father was arrested. In the immediate aftermath of Theresa's death, the children had been cared for by Stefan's family members who believed their father was innocent. They had been told their mother died in a car accident, and they were being protected from media coverage of the investigation. When Stefan confessed, the children's entire world collapsed for a second time. Not only had they lost their beloved mother, but they learned that their father, the person they had looked to for comfort and stability during the most difficult period of their lives, was responsible for her death. Stefan's extended family made the painful decision to tell the children the truth in age-appropriate ways, with the help of professional counselors. The family rallied around Harper, Charlotte, and Sienna, providing them with love, stability, and therapy to help them process the unimaginable trauma they had experienced. Stefan's brothers established trust funds for the children's education and future needs, using some of the remaining assets from Stefan's business ventures and the sale of the family home. Theresa's family in the Philippines, despite their profound grief and limited resources, maintained contact with the children and provided them with stories and photos of their mother's childhood. The children never visited their father in prison. This decision was made by the family and their therapists, who felt that maintaining contact with Stefan would be psychologically harmful and prevent the children from healing. Stefan, to his credit, agreed with this decision and signed away his parental rights to make adoption by extended family members easier. Harper, the oldest, struggled the most with anger and feelings of betrayal. Charlotte withdrew into herself and had difficulty trusting adults. Sienna, perhaps because she was youngest, seemed to adapt most quickly to her new life with her uncle's family, though she would sometimes ask when Daddy was coming home, not understanding that he never would. This case highlights one of the most tragic aspects of domestic violence: the children who lose both parents, one to death and one to their own destructive choices. What do you think is the best way to help children heal from this kind of trauma? And do you think Stefan made the right choice in signing away his parental rights? Stefan Wagner was transferred to Cheshire Correctional Institution in Connecticut, where he began serving his 20-year sentence. According to prison records, he was a model inmate who participated in educational programs and maintained a low profile. He never gave interviews to media outlets and declined all requests to discuss his case publicly. But Stefan's story didn't end with his imprisonment. In 2015, Stefan filed an appeal of his conviction, arguing that his defense lawyers had been ineffective and that the jury should have been presented with more evidence about his psychological state at the time of the murder. The appeal was denied, with the court finding that Stefan had received adequate representation and that the verdict was supported by the evidence. Stefan became eligible for parole in 2021 after serving 12 years of his sentence. However, his first parole hearing did not go well. Members of Theresa's family submitted victim impact statements describing the ongoing pain of losing Theresa and the trauma experienced by her children. The parole board also noted that Stefan had never completed domestic violence counseling or taken responsibility for the pattern of control and deception that led to the murder. Stefan's parole was denied. His next eligibility hearing is scheduled for 2024. Whether he will be granted parole at that time depends largely on his willingness to demonstrate genuine understanding of his crimes and completion of recommended counseling programs. Meanwhile, Joshua Taylor and his wife Patricia divorced within a year of Theresa's death. Joshua relocated to another state and has largely avoided public attention, though he did testify during Stefan's trial about his relationship with Theresa. Patricia Taylor never spoke publicly about the case, though friends said she struggled with guilt over her threats toward Theresa in the days before the murder. The case had a lasting impact on the Connecticut legal system as well. Prosecutors began taking domestic violence cases more seriously, particularly those involving patterns of control, financial abuse, and elaborate deception. Law enforcement agencies implemented new training protocols to help officers recognize the warning signs of escalating domestic violence. The staging aspect of Stefan's crime also led to improved crime scene analysis techniques. Investigators now receive specialized training in recognizing staged scenes and the psychological profiles of perpetrators who attempt to cover up their crimes through elaborate deceptions. What makes the Stefan Wagner case so chilling isn't just the murder itself, but the years of calculated deception that preceded it. Dr. Amanda Richardson, a forensic psychologist who has studied the case extensively, believes that Stefan's pattern of lies and control represents a textbook example of what experts call coercive control, a form of domestic abuse that doesn't involve physical violence but creates a prison of psychological manipulation. The warning signs were present from the very beginning of Stefan and Theresa's relationship. The age deception wasn't just vanity, it was Stefan's first test of whether he could control the fundamental facts of their relationship. When Theresa accepted the marriage despite discovering the lie, it reinforced Stefan's belief that he could manipulate reality to suit his needs. The elaborate backstory about meeting in Hawaii rather than through correspondence showed Stefan's deep shame about the unconventional nature of their relationship, but also his willingness to involve Theresa in ongoing deceptions. Stefan's possessiveness and control over Theresa's social activities escalated gradually, using his wealth and claims of protection to justify increasingly isolating behavior. The blackmail scheme represents one of the most psychologically sophisticated forms of abuse experts have ever documented. By becoming his own wife's blackmailer, Stefan achieved multiple goals simultaneously. He discovered the affair without having to admit to spying on her. He created an external threat that made Theresa turn to him for protection, and he eliminated her relationship with Joshua while positioning himself as her devoted supporter. Dr. Richardson notes that perpetrators of coercive control often escalate to violence when they realize their psychological methods are failing. In Stefan's case, Theresa's decision to leave the marriage represented the ultimate failure of his control systems. When someone has spent years believing they can manipulate reality itself, Dr. Richardson explains, the prospect of losing control completely can trigger a psychological crisis that leads to extreme violence. The staging of Theresa's death as a car accident was consistent with Stefan's lifelong pattern of creating elaborate alternative versions of reality when the truth didn't serve his purposes. In the years following Stefan's conviction, Theresa's family and friends have worked to ensure that she is remembered not as a victim, but as a vibrant woman who fought for independence and a better life for herself and her children. The Theresa Wagner Memorial Fund was established in 2012 to provide educational scholarships for young women from the Philippines who want to study in the United States. The fund has helped dozens of women achieve their dreams of American education, the same dream that brought Theresa to Stefan's attention more than a decade earlier. Theresa's sister Maria, who flew from the Philippines to attend Stefan's trial, has become an advocate for domestic violence awareness in her home country. She speaks regularly about the warning signs of controlling relationships and the importance of maintaining independence, even within marriage. "My sister was not a weak woman," Maria said in a 2020 interview. "She was strong, intelligent, and brave. But even strong women can find themselves trapped by men who use love as a weapon." Theresa's story is not just about one terrible man. It's about how our society allows men to believe they own the women in their lives. The Wagner children, now young adults, have chosen to live their lives privately. Harper graduated from college in 2019 and is working in healthcare, a field his mother would have been proud of. Charlotte is studying psychology, perhaps influenced by her own journey through trauma and healing. Sienna, now a teenager, is an excellent student who has expressed interest in international relations and helping immigrants adapt to American life. None of the children have chosen to use the Wagner surname as adults. They have maintained relationships with both sides of their extended family, but have made it clear that they do not consider Stefan to be part of their lives. In a statement released through their guardian in 2021, they asked that media outlets respect their privacy and focus on honoring their mother's memory rather than sensationalizing their father's crimes. The Stefan Wagner case offers a chilling look at how seemingly small deceptions can escalate into elaborate webs of control and manipulation that ultimately lead to tragedy. Stefan began with what he probably considered a harmless lie about his age, just a small deception to give himself a better chance at love with a beautiful younger woman. But each subsequent lie required additional lies to maintain, and each successful manipulation reinforced his belief that he could control reality through careful deception. By the time Stefan murdered his wife, he had spent over a decade living in a world where truth was optional and other people's autonomy was negotiable. The case also highlights the particular vulnerability of immigrant women in controlling relationships. Theresa's distance from her family, her financial dependence on Stefan, and her unfamiliarity with American legal and social systems all made it harder for her to recognize the danger she was in and to seek help when she needed it. But perhaps most importantly, this case reminds us that domestic violence isn't always about physical abuse. The most dangerous abusers are often those who use psychological manipulation, financial control, and elaborate deceptions to create prisons that their victims don't even recognize as cages until it's too late to escape safely. Theresa Wagner fought for her freedom and paid the ultimate price. Her story serves as both a warning about the dangers of coercive control and an inspiration to anyone who is struggling to break free from a manipulative relationship. Thank you for joining me for this episode of Once Upon a Voice. Remember, beneath every lie, the truth is waiting to be discovered. This case raises so many questions about love, control, and the lengths people will go to maintain their carefully constructed lives. What aspects of Stefan's psychology do you find most disturbing? And what you think could have been done differently to save Theresa's life? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay safe, trust your instincts, and remember that real love never requires you to lose yourself.